Democracy That Delivers is brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. Now, to your host.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center podcast brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. My name is Frank Brown, and I'm the director of the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center at CIPE. And I'm very pleased today to welcome my co-host, Ben Schmidt, who's joining me from Sao Paulo, Brazil, as well as the hackathon team from Accountability Lab. And to give you a little bit of background, Accountability Lab is one of the most innovative, generous, and forward-looking NGOs in the anti-corruption space. We have collaborated with them for years and are especially happy in the last 24 months to be working with them in the lead on a anti-corruption hackathon project called the HackCorruption project. And this is quite different from ordinary hackathons that listeners may have come across in their experience. And we're hoping today in this podcast episode to dig in as to why that is the case, what makes it different, what the experience has been so far, and what the potential is going forward for developing what is truly an innovative line of work in the anti-corruption field. And with that, I'd like to introduce the team from Accountability Lab. These are the hackathon specialists with whom we work at CIPE as we put forward the HackCorruption project around the world.
Hello, Frank. Hello to our listeners. I'm Eva Sander. I'm joining from Mexico City. I'm the acting director for Accountability Lab Mexico, and I've been on the civic tech and GovTech ecosystem for almost 15 years.
Hi, listeners, and thank you to CIPE for having us today. My name is Sherry Erasmus, and I'm the Global Director of Learning at Accountability Lab. And in my role, I usually work on the startup of new project streams, such as this very exciting HackCorruption project.
Hi, Frank. Thanks for having us, Frank and Ben. My name is Sarah Haynes, and I am the Global Manager of Programs and Partnerships. And I'm pretty new to the Accountability Lab team. My background is in working with young people, and I have experience in governance in the United States. And I'm brand new to this project, so excited to be on board.
And it's great to have you all on our podcast. And I'm looking forward to a really information-packed 25 minutes. I'm curious, heard about hackathons for years, never heard about one that focuses on corruption. What's the difference?
Well, it definitely is not the first anti-corruption hackathon. There has been many around the world. But what does make this project totally different is that we're focusing on the outcomes. We're not focusing just only on getting, a bunch of super talented coders together to create platforms. There's many, many platforms out there that help you with governance, that help you track certain issues. But we do feel that there's a link missing, and that missing link deals with understanding the problem, understanding the context, and really building a community of people interested in tackling those problems by using also a super diverse set of knowledge and life experiences in order to create engagement from the potential users. So this is about empowering the community through the use of technology, approach the anti-corruption ecosystem.
So Eva, that's really helpful. It sounds big, it sounds ambitious, it sounds labor intensive. Could you or one of our other guests describe in very practical terms, somebody walks into this hackathon, what's different? What do they find different? How long is the engagement? What, in very practical terms, what level of support do you have to provide in order to attain the goals you're talking about?
Frank, I like to describe this hackathon as more than a single event, but rather an ongoing or book-ended hackathon in a way. So when you register and you become a participant, you're immediately onboarded in a way that gives you the knowledge and context and access to specialists so that even before you get to the actual 3-day hackathon, we've really primed you on the governance issues we're going to be working on. Again, that's very outcomes focused. And then beyond the hackathon, after we've selected the 5 teams with the most promising ideas for anti-corruption tech tools, we also continue with the engagement with experts as mentors and a robust ancillary program like the bootcamp, which Sarah can tell us a little bit more about, which is all about continuing to build alongside the hackers on their ideas, equipping them with some financial support, knowledge support, and a community around them to really move their ideas from, just a small spark to a prototype to something that they can put in front of potential users and will hopefully get adopted by governments or CSOs.
That's super helpful. So I have one more question for you, and then I'll turn it over to my co-host, Ben. But could you describe for the listeners what it was like when you first came into contact in South Africa with your hackers, with the folks on the teams? So you're giving them a high degree of support and nurturing. You're getting to know them. You know their backstory. You're spending a lot of time so they understand what the goal is here. And when they all get in the room, there must have been sort of an electricity or some sort of a vibe that you haven't come across before in hackathons. Could one of you describe what that felt like?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in on that. We were really excited to have our participants from 6 countries from across the region, so not just from South Africa, to come in. And these young people came with a set of expertise from blockchain to AI to coding and some with governance expertise as well. So there was a real sense of collaboration from the start. And they had already been able to participate in sessions surrounding the problem sets that were provided by SIPE. So they came in with some background and knowledge of what they might want to work on together. So there was a lot of excitement, and there was also kind of a lot of unknowns. And so we had to kind of make sure everyone had the support they needed and that they were grouped together in teams, either that they had wanted to work with or with people that they had met, to create that kind of synergy for themselves. So we did our best to create a supportive environment and give them ownership over what the next few days were going to look like.
Thanks, Sarah. And I'll turn it over to Ben.
Thanks, Frank. So this is Ben Schmidt, Program Officer at ACGC, and I was privileged to join the Accountability Lab team at the hackathon in late July of 2022 in South Africa, and can personally attest to the energy in the room being, I think, one of a bunch of very different individuals from the Southern Africa area coming together for this kind of once in a generation, I think to them it must have felt like that, opportunity to discuss their various countries' corruption problems and try to use their tools and their expertise to find solutions to it. I could definitely see that they were so excited to get together and try to come up with solutions for their countries, and to work collaboratively with people across these different countries, these neighboring countries, on these solutions. And so I can definitely say that from being on the ground that they were excited about that. So I'm going to do a 2-part question. The first part of this question has to do with kind of how did this come about? So who was behind the creation of a regional or global hack corruption or hackathon that would try to solve anti-corruption problems? And how was it that the decision was made to focus on Southern Africa?
I'm happy to kickstart the first part of your 2-parter, Ben. So essentially, we received Accountability Lab in partnership with SIPE, received funding from the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, or better known as INL, at the State Department. We received a grant to implement this type of project that would find and bring together young people to find tech solutions for anti-corruption problems. Now, to understand why we went to Southern Africa first, it's really that design phase and co-creation phase of a project that makes you think about what is there to leverage, what are the ways in which we can amplify our work by plugging into other existing processes in the ecosystem. So one example of that would be that at the end of last year in December, the US government kickstarted the Summit for Democracy, where leaders from around the world made commitments to democratic values and strengthening policies in their countries. And 2022 was then identified as the year the year of action, in which we would try to really see governments move forward on these commitments. A lot of these democracy-focused commitments were obviously linked to anti-corruption efforts. And so what we really wanted to do to plug into this existing stream of work within the USG is to land the first pilot HackCorruption event in a space where we could gather people from countries who were part of making these commitments.
So what have the results been so far? Technically, we're speaking here in November, and we've had some time since July. So what's happened since July, and what have we been trying to bring in the next few months?
There's a lot of things that need to go on starting November and moving forward. If we think about the desired outcomes that we're focusing in, I think one of the most important ones is fostering this community. So we do see the HackCorruption alumni as part of a seed network of entrepreneurs that are using technology to tackle on corruption. So right now we are weaving that community through collaboration tools such as Slack to really be able to have ongoing conversations with our participants, and by also monitoring what kind of help they need in order to keep moving forward. There's also a monitoring part of the work that's part basically of the learning process, in which we are seeing, how the teams are interacting with each other, what kind of things they're having a hard time with, what kind of new insights they're bringing into a table. So starting November comes the reality check of how things are going. And it also allows for us to take all of the key learnings in order to design the next hackathon in another one of the countries we're going to be working on. So there's a lot of prep work going on. There's a lot of interaction and community building with the first cohort of the HackCorruption alumni.
Yeah, I support everything that Ava said. I agree. These are kind of the steps that are happening since the boot camp. In between the hackathon and the boot camp, we also worked hard to create some ancillary programming to support the participants from the time that they kind of created this idea through the time that they were going to get back together in Johannesburg for the boot camp event. And so we brought in experts in everything from stakeholder mapping to beneficial ownership to procurement data and business development. We also did a workshop in design and just created really kind of like a 6-week programming format where once a week we kind of brought in an expert to talk about these subject matters that would be super useful for the participants between the hackathon and the boot camp, and to kind of prep them for what the boot camp would be. So that's kind of the series of events that happened in between, and where we tried to support them in getting ready really to take their solutions to the next step.
Yeah, and just at this juncture, I think it might be helpful. So we had the hackathon in July, and then we had a boot camp in October, and then we've got next steps with the community, as you've been discussing, Ava. Sherry, could you mind kind of just giving us an overview of what was the timeline in the lead up to the hackathon? How many people were there? How many teams won? How many teams showed up to the boot camp? Could you just give us kind of some overarching details so our listeners can understand more or less who we're talking about and where and the timeline?
Absolutely, Ben. So yes, as you mentioned, we started out with the hackathon in July. Of course, before that, we had a lot of orientation happening around the governance themes, but we essentially brought together in hybrid, so a combination of virtual and in-person participants, 100 hackathon participants in July, and they were brought into smaller teams of 4 and 5 participants, making use of a combination of skills. So hackers, people with real policy and governance expertise, also activists, people who could really, with a combination of their skills in a team, move an idea forward. And by the end of that, we brought in an expert panel of judges to review what they had come up with by the end of a hackathon. And we're left with 5 teams with the strongest ideas, mostly around procurement transparency in this first hackathon, that were identified as ideas with real potential for buy-in and further build out. We then, as Sarah mentioned, went on with this ancillary programming, and in October really brought all 5 of those teams with a couple of more really promising hackers online, and with the 5 teams in person in Johannesburg, gathered everyone again for a 3-day accelerated bootcamp that really helped them firstly iron out some of the challenges with their with their ideas and moving them forward with the help of mentors who were there both virtually and in person. But secondly, also build a brand and a story around what they're trying to do. Is that is so important to not only getting further resources for your idea, but also solidifying buy-in from those who would ultimately use your idea. And what we're now doing at this point in the timeline is really just the ongoing support with both resources and knowledge to get them to a place where they can put this in front of people and hopefully get some uptake from governments in their countries for this. What I will say as an indicator that makes HackCorruption quite unique as well is that 40% of our participants were women, which is above the industry average for women in tech. And I think that's really something to be proud of, because as we looked at other hackathons in this realm, as we were planning our own, there are really stark sort of gender disparities in the participant pool. And so we're really proud of being able to create this learning sandbox where it is so diverse, because we all know that there's enough evidence that shows that better governance decisions get made when there's gender parity of participants.
Yeah, I remember that really stood out to me. I worked in IT before I came and worked at Site, and it was so male dominated. It sometimes wasn't even funny. And when you got a woman on the team, it totally changed the dynamic. It changed the creative energy of an IT team, of a sales team, of an engineering team. And to have such a large proportion of the participants at the hackathon who are women, it really made the problem solving, it made the team dynamics, I think, much more, open-minded about the solutions as they were being built. And I think that was a real accomplishment of the way that this hackathon was prepared and executed, was to have such a diverse group, not only 6 different countries in Southern Africa, not only a variety of different backgrounds, but also a large proportion of women.
So I had a quick follow-up question. Listening to Sherry speak, and Ben, your comments as well, it really brings home just how diverse, from a multitude of backgrounds, professional, gender, etc., the participants were. And I'm thinking that must be somewhat problematic, right? So a typical hackathon, you have a problem to solve. It's sort of you're aiming to get a prize. You have a limited amount of time to do so. It's a fairly sort of straightforward transaction. Whereas what you are talking about is it sounds much different. Like where you have to navigate all these different backgrounds and identities and sets of incentives and priorities. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. Like it sounds like it might have been a little bumpy at the beginning.
I think, Frank, that everything that's disruptive tends to be bumpy, being able to survive in chaos and being able to thrive under kind of harsh circumstances really makes this a social galvanization experience, right? It does bring people closer together. It does allow for tough conversations, for interesting debate, and it takes a very special kind of person to be involved. You have to be tolerant, you have to be open, you have to allow yourself to think differently. You have to allow yourself to come out of the box, and sometimes stay out of the box and not go back into your old ways. So yes, of course, it proved to be challenging, but it also proved that it was the right way to move forward. As I was saying in the beginning, we have amazing platforms that are not used, just because when you are creating the customer journey or the user journey, you don't take into account this multi-perspective outlook, right? So being able to see things from the typical citizen outlook, or seeing it from someone that has worked inside the government, allows for things to be, they just have a lot more usability, right? So UX, usability, being able to focus on human-centered design, putting people in the center of things whilst creating these solutions, these technologies, these apps, these platforms, these data crunching bots, or whatever the kids were coming up with, really needs for that diversity. Maybe one of the key learnings for many, many years involved in hackathons is that it's always the same people trying to tend to the same kind of problems. And this was a really different experience.
So, Ben, if you don't mind, one more question to our guests. So given the amount of effort, the time, the resources, the travel, the sort of nurturing and support necessary to get to where you've gotten so far, and we're not at the end yet, as I understand it, but given all that, do you have any sort of early verdict on whether it's worth the effort? Are the solutions, are the results going to justify the tremendous effort that's gone into this so far? Or is the jury still out?
I think, Frank, it comes down to how we see the project, right? If we see it as a hackathon for the sake of a hackathon, I think we've already made great strides. We've brought people together. There are some budgeting ideas that are coming out of this that will hopefully, take flight. However, the hackathon in and of itself for us is just a vehicle to build a network of new GovTech enthusiasts who take the principles that they learn through our hackathon and apply it in other things that they may go on to do. Because in reality, we may get some really good ideas that take off and get adopted by governments after this, or we may not. There are also plenty of civic tech and gov tech tools out there in the world collecting dust. But if we can create a platform that really brings together people who have diverse skills, who want to be part of a community, who continue to solve anti-corruption issues, who continue to look at the challenges of their country in a way that is solutions-oriented, then I think that's where you make a difference, because you're ultimately building movement and you're fostering a generation of change makers. And in that sense, I can't speak for all of my colleagues, but in that sense, I think it's worth it. And I think we're making great strides in that sense. Also, just in terms of the cross-country integration that really hasn't happened before. And as this program continues, the potential of taking this to other regions is really exciting, because what we'll end up with is a global network. And I think that's worth the additional effort to go beyond just a standard hackathon.
And another thing, Sherry, I think it would be super interesting for us to share the importance of learning. These challenges, these chaos or whatever is really giving us an insider's look on the new generations. So bridging the gap, between us that are right now in policy making or creating these projects and the newcomers, which are coming from a totally different generation than ours, is amazing. So just by getting those learnings, we are helping to bridge the gap between the world that we want and the world that we're actually living in.
That's a really good comment, Yvonne. It reminds me of the impression that I had working as a virtual mentor at the boot camp. I was calling into one of the teams, one of the very promising teams, working on this open procurement solution. And as they told me, what their organization chart that they created for their team, the different responsibilities that they'd have, the weekly meetings that they were going to be holding, and how they were going to move forward towards getting more, not only developing their product and developing their solution, but also getting stakeholders on board, I started realizing that as much as we called it a HackCorruption hackathon event, you might as well have called it a anti-corruption incubation event, where we incubated teams that are cross, like we said, different backgrounds, but also cross-national, cross-regional. And there was a member of that particular team that he didn't have IT skills. He was a bachelor's in marketing. And his marketing skills made him the business lead for this team. Whereas the other ones who were kind of the head coder or the head tester or the head kind of the team leader, they were performing different roles, and how bringing together this diverse group was yes, it was creating this pro anti-corruption movement, but it was like we were building little businesses, little 5-man businesses.
Totally. Well, 5 men and women businesses, because most of the teams had a ton of girls in them. But anyway, another thing that's pretty cool is that we are realizing that these projects fit right into our accountepreneurial ecosystem. So we have been focusing on pushing new accountepreneurs that are business minded, that know how to, create the right kind of thing so that more people can support it and it can be autosufficient and whatnot. It can just permeate and withstand, the test of time. They're not dependent on a grant. They know how to create their own resources, etc. So, bringing into the accountepreneurial ecosystem people who are really tech savvy is proving super exciting.
So, Eva, I had a quick follow-up question on that. So, you talk about this in sort of commercial business terms, which raises the question, what the folks are doing in the HackCorruption exercise going to have a commercial application or be sustainable, or is it too early to tell? Like, how does this end?
I think it's not too early to tell. I think that some projects definitely have a commercial kind of implementation, and into their own business model canvases, we can see some of the projects already thinking about what product they're going to be selling. Now, if we are talking about entrepreneurship, we have to dig in a bit deeper and think about impact entrepreneurs. So it's a very specific kind of entrepreneur that it's not only seeking, financial gain, but also is looking to construct a more just world, a better standard of living, and things like that. So building in the right KPIs that are impact driven is going to be what sets this bunch of projects apart, I think.
That's fascinating. And before I turn over the last question to Ben, just to clarify what you were saying, Eva, is that the folks that you're targeting to be on these hackathon teams are motivated by much more than just a profit motive or potential commercial success, that their values will drive them to sacrifice their time and energy and expertise to pursue this regardless of the potential sort of gain to themselves. Is that right?
Yeah, and it's like a very strong balance. You don't have to sacrifice your time, you have to invest your time, right? So if their efforts, if their times, if their resources are focused into creating something that is not dependent of a government grant, that is not dependent by a foundation grant, but that actually has its own business model within it, that it's financially viable, we are taking a lot of time into ensuring that these projects are investment ready. Where the investment is coming from, we still don't know. If it's going to come from the private sector, angel investors, government officials, foundations, or friends and family, or crowdfunding, that's still to be seen. But we are having a very strong focus on ensuring that these kids, that these young people, these young entrepreneurs understand that they need to be independent in order to be able to flourish.
Super. Thank you. Ben?
Would it be possible for you to tell us what's next? What's the next region, and how are you going to decide?
I'm looking at my colleagues and hoping that someone else would sort of take this question, because the long and the short of this is that we don't know, but we're hoping to know within the next couple of weeks and hoping to know in at least by the start of next year. What we are hoping for is that we can continue with this regional model, so that it's not just identifying young people from one country, but rather, again, creating another regional hub. And what makes sense to us, just as we've been designing over the last few months, is that we think it would make sense to take this type of model to South Asia, potentially with Nepal as a hub, and identifying young people from countries around Nepal to participate. And a second option would be Latin America, as we think there's real potential there as well. But would love for Eva and Sarah to jump in on next steps here too.
For me, as Sherry said, well, we don't know officially, but what we do know is that a bunch of the other Accountability Lab country directors have gotten so excited over this program that they have been creating their own programming around the HackCorruption brand. So we are seeing, stuff happening in Nigeria. We are seeing stuff happening in Mexico, that under the umbrella of the HackCorruption and its skill learnings, we are creating new innovative programs in partnership with other amazing stakeholders within our regions.
And I'll add on to what Sherry and Eva shared by saying, with this particular cohort from Africa, what we're seeing as next steps, a couple of tangible things. A lot of these teams came in with pretty big ideas. So a lot of what happened during the boot camp was the mentors kind of shaping them towards starting at a local level or a smaller level and helping them scale up from there. So that seems to be the next step for this particular cohort. And another pretty tangible thing we've seen as a next step is one of our participants actually has already run her own hackathon in Namibia. And another is going to contribute to the Accountapreneur program that's happening in Kenya. So we're kind of seeing a bit of activity across different programs that we run, and people wanting to be part of like a bigger network and continue this kind of work in their own networks as well.
That's a wonderful way to end this podcast, I think, is by looking at how this unique mix of people, that's, as I understand it, has never been put together before, is going to turn out, and the sort of early indications of what sort of spin-offs and dividends may result. I want to thank all of you for taking time out on a busy Monday to join us from all over the world, literally. My co-host Ben from Sao Paulo, Brazil, Ava Sander from Mexico City, Sherry Erasmus and Sarah Haynes from the greater Washington, D.C. area. This has been a great podcast. I've learned a lot myself, and I really look forward to, in a couple of years' time, checking in and seeing what happened to all these teams, what they've done, and picking up on Ava's point, to what extent they've realized their dream of impacting and reducing corruption in their local environments. And finally, a thanks to Kendall, our producer, without whom none of this would have been possible. We look forward to seeing you at the next edition of the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center podcast here at SIPE. Take care.
Democracy That Delivers has been brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. For more information, please visit sipe.org.